Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. It's great to see you here in this chilly, yet cozy afternoon in October. I'm Guillermo Ruiz de Teresa. I'm Deputy Director and Curator at Storefront for Art and Architecture. Storefront is just across the street at the corner of Lafayette and Kenmare. Was founded in 1982 by artists and architects in this very neighborhood. And for over 40 years, it has explored how art and architecture can shape and be shaped by public life, amplifying the ways we understand and inhabit the built environment. Tonight marks a very special occasion for us. Public space and its defense has always been central to Storefront's mission. Yet this is the first project we've presented beyond our gallery walls in nearly 2 decades. We are gathered here for public address, a new exhibition by Alex Strada that reflects on the voices that shape New York's public sphere and the shared responsibility of building a more equitable city. This evening's conversation, The Right to the City, Homelessness, and Advocacy, deeply resonates with the values at the core of our institution. It brings together remarkable thinkers and advocates from distinct disciplines who reminds us of the essential role art and civic imagination play in confronting what remain, 40 years on, some of the most urgent issues of our time: housing, displacement, and the right to home. Please join me in welcoming Alex Strada. So Alex is an artist, educator, and lifelong New Yorker. And through research-driven collaborative projects, she reimagines systems of power and creates platforms for collectivity and civic transformation. Since 2022, she has served as public artist in residence with New York City's Department of Homeless Services and Department of Cultural Affairs. She teaches at the Pratt Institute. And she will introduce our panelists, share the agenda for tonight's discussion, and moderate the conversation. Please join me in welcoming Alex Strada.
Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to briefly give some context into this installation. So this project is called Public Address, and we have the sounds of the city underlying our gathering here today. So I have been the public artist in residence with the Department of Homeless Services since 2022, and this has been a really kind of incredible and complex few years of being embedded within city government. The idea behind the residency is that artists are given full access to an agency. You get a city ID card, email address, a cubicle, and the rest is really up to you to figure out what it is you want to do. You have a kind of small budget to pursue some kind of project. And I had taught art in shelters for many years, but I never had the kind of access that this residency came with. So I decided to spend the first year really just listening to people and visiting as many shelters as I could. And that prolonged period of engagement and talking to people is really what enabled this project to exist, where I wanted to come up with a structure where people experiencing homelessness, who often are spoken about or for and not necessarily given a platform to be listened to, where there could be a project that challenged that. So inside shelter, there are logbooks. These are usually official record-keeping devices that staff use to write down what they think is important at the end of their shift. And as an artist, I was also fascinated by these objects, this handwritten form of record-keeping. And using that kind of bureaucratic tool, I've been inviting people who are living and working in shelter, but for the most part, what are called clients, so people experiencing homelessness living in shelter, to write down what they think is important in these official record-keeping books. And what we're kind of nestled amidst are those different responses that people have contributed to the project. They are all printed on official aluminum city street signs. So through different interdepartmental negotiations and collaboration, the Department of Transportation relented and agreed to print these log entries. So what you see here today is the first of an iterative installation that will continue to travel across the 5 boroughs. Inside every borough, there is one large-scale installation. Himil will also pass out, for anyone who's interested, the newsprint that accompanies this project, where in that newsprint you will see a map of where all the small scale signs are installed. There's one small sign per community district currently in Manhattan, and next the project will go to Brooklyn, and from there Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island over the course of around a year. So this is our inaugural program, and I am really thrilled to have with me 2 people that I wouldn't have wanted to open this project with more than these 2. And we'll talk more about the specifics of the project, but I wanted to give you just a kind of general overview. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 2 guests today. We have with us Jennifer Egan, a Pulitzer-Prize-winning novelist and a journalist. Her year-long reporting on street homelessness and supportive housing appeared in the New Yorker magazine in September 2023. She has taught literature at the University of Pennsylvania and has served as a president of PEN America. Will Watts is the Deputy Executive Director for Advocacy at Coalition for the Homeless, where he is responsible for overseeing the organization's policy and litigation work, as well as its monitoring of New York City's shelters run by the Department of Homeless Services. Prior to joining the coalition, Will practiced law in Los Angeles, advocating for justice on behalf of disenfranchised and low-income communities. Prior to legal aid, Will held a variety of positions, including as a faculty member at UCLA School of Law, the directing attorney for the Homelessness Prevention Law Project at Public Counsel, and as a real estate partner and DLA Piper LLP. So with that, I will invite up here Jenny to give us a reading to help kind of ground and understand some of the complexities that are critical to homelessness and the state of homelessness today.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. Alex told me about this project, I guess maybe 2 years ago. Or maybe 1 year ago, and I thought, really, are you somehow going to pull this off? I just am so amazed and happy that you did. So I'm just going to read a short amount of the story that I wrote for the New Yorker. It was very long, so this is just a tiny segment. As Alex said, I researched it for about a year. It's a tip of the iceberg. The enclaves that people make for themselves outdoors in New York, temporary, vulnerable, subject to vandalism, confiscation, and theft, are proof of how primal the nesting instinct is for nearly all of us. Many formerly unhoused people speak almost tenderly of my spot or my place. Under scaffolding, on church steps, on roofs or stairwells, in abandoned cars. While accompanying an outreach team in Brooklyn, I saw a frail black woman using bleach and a broom to scour not just the sidewalk around her makeshift home, constructed of brightly colored beach umbrellas under elevated subway tracks, but the street itself. John Wood, a white man in his 50s who moved to 90 Sands in March. 90 Sands is a supportive housing building in Brooklyn, which was sort of the geographical focus of my article. John Wood, a white man in his 50s who moved into 90 Sands in March, told me that he'd come to the city from upstate 8 years ago with his wife, called my soulmate, with whom he shared a heroin addiction. The pair refused to be separated into shelters, and Wood instead constructed a series of insulated cave homes, gouging them into hillsides in Riverside and Morningside parks. At night, the couple lit their caves with dozens of candles whose eerie, flickering beauty Wood captured in videos on his cell phone. That phone was long gone, as were the homes, each eventually discovered and destroyed, as was Wood's soulmate, who died of blood poisoning resulting from her drug use. But the memory was clearly a vivid one, and I will add that Wood himself has also passed away now. Many people describe acts of kindness from strangers who came to know them over time in their chosen spots. A young woman I spoke with who immigrated from South Asia with her family when she was 11 became homeless in her 20s after refusing an arranged marriage. Her parents banished her from their apartment, and she lived in and around parks in Queens for several years, hardly speaking to anyone, often weeping, but cared for by locals who left her plates of food, blankets, towels, and money when they passed her on their way to work. In January, I joined a CUCS supervisor for street outreach for a 5:30 a.m. shift in Upper Manhattan. It was a code blue day, and we looked for 3 individuals who required wellness checks, but weren't visible that morning. Likely they'd gone underground to avoid a deluge of rain the previous night. We were also searching for a 4th person, a black woman named Aisha Stone, a wheelchair-bound amputee who had discharged herself from Harlem Hospital. She'd been admitted with COVID, but hadn't returned to the Kelly, a safe haven where she had been living for several months. We drove past a corner bodega in West Harlem that was Aisha's usual spot, but she wasn't there. In Upper Harlem and Morningside Heights, we canvassed several areas where homeless individuals often encamp, including one under the Henry Hudson Parkway, accessible by a short hike through underbrush. I followed into a breathtaking debris field of single-use plastics and kaleidoscopic trash. Though devoid of human beings, the place intimated a breadth of recent activity: soiled mattresses, lighters, brooms and brushes, cigarette butts, a sequined blue dress, rain-sodden socks, plastic cutlery, lipsticks, curlers, a spool of thread, a hurricane lamp, a crushed baby stroller, and a ubiquitous sprinkling of orange syringe caps. It was a reminder that life doesn't stop for people who live outdoors, invisible though they often are to the rest of us. Aisha Stone, the woman we had been looking for, articulated this point to me a couple of weeks later after outreach workers had located her by the bodega, and she'd cheerfully accepted a ride back to the Kelly. "I had a life before this," Aisha said, once she'd rolled her wheelchair into a small office off the Kelly's bustling hallway. "When I was homeless, I used to roll around the streets at night. I like being outside. I'm like a butterfly. There's a piece of solitude. I was able to talk to God. If God spoke back, I was able to hear him. Either a thought or an emotion, I was able to connect to God. I roll the streets like wee. I own the streets. There are no cars." The wheelchair was a relatively new addition to Aisha's life. In 2020, she was run over by a subway train that severed her left foot and half of her left hand. She had a prosthetic leg, but it hurt to wear it. At 51, she was a riveting presence, radiant, athletic, and a mesmerizing narrator of a dizzying life story. Sexually abused from age 5 by her stepfather and 3 older brothers, dismissed by her mother even after the abuse was corroborated by another family member, introduced to crack cocaine at 13 by family friends who had driven her to an after-school swimming practice. Aisha left home, Far Rockaway, that year and survived on the streets thereafter, mostly around Times Square, where she sold drugs and sought out the company of people who would protect her. She served multiple prison sentences for drug dealing. The last time, this is Aisha talking, the last time was 4.5 to 9, and I did every bit of 9 years because I did 4 state bids already. So I became a persistent predicate, which means you keep doing the same goddamn thing and you're gonna get it. But I'm not mad at that. In prison, she added, I became a welder, I became a metal fabricator, a cook, I got my GED, and then I got with the older women and I listened. I knew they didn't want nothing from me. I could sit down and actually be okay with listening, you know? And I learned. So when I came home, I was a woman, and every bit of a phenomenal woman. And everything I had was enhanced. Everybody will say you become pessimistic from being in prison. Nope. N-O. I found refuge. When Aisha completed her sentence, she was in her late 30s. She returned to New York and reconnected with an old acquaintance who became her husband. What followed was a golden interlude. The owner of the Brooklyn halfway house where Aisha stayed after prison agreed to rent her a house in Prospect Lefferts Gardens, and she and her husband lived there with their 9 cats. Both stopped using and went on methadone. Aisha's husband had maintenance jobs at 2 churches, and Aisha worked at a deli and went to TCI college. Every other Thursday, they took the train to Harlem for a comedy show. Then their housing fell apart. They were supposed to move into a rental apartment in Brooklyn brownstone, but the building was sold to new owners who rescinded the agreement, a development that seems to have crushed them. We got a monkey wrench thrown in our plans. It felt like all our hard work just went down the drain, Aisha told me. They went to a family shelter and were placed in a boarding house on Park Avenue in Harlem that was vermin infested. Both went back to drugs and began drinking heavily. We used to sit there and watch the mice play tag on our table. Everything it went downhill. Everything you built, you watch it disappear just like that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Now, I have to admit that Jenny is a hard act to follow. All of us at the Coalition for the Homeless actually are quite fond of Jenny and are very grateful for all that she does to, thank you, shine a light on the community that we serve. And so I'm actually quite honored to be spending this time this afternoon and discussing this topic with her. So I'll just also say that for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read the article from which Jenny was just sharing, I highly recommend you do so. Not only does it provide you with some general information about homelessness, but I think that it also helps remind us that when we're talking about homelessness, we are talking about our neighbors. And just like us, they are people seeking connection to themselves, connection to one another, and connection to place. And certainly the details from Jenny's story shares that place is here in New York. But it very well could be any other metropolitan area across the country. And I say that because anyone like me who has spent considerable time in Los Angeles or other parts on the West Coast have met people like John Wood or the young woman from South Asia who, as Jenny described, lived on the streets in areas they would identify as my spot or my place. In fact, in Los Angeles County, there are 47,000 such people. Anyone who has seen those images, you see that people are living in encampments, in RVs, in cars, throughout the entire county. Some of them a stone's throw away from some of the most affluent neighborhoods like Brentwood and Venice Beach. So here in New York, we don't have that volume of individuals that we see day to day on our streets. Now, that doesn't mean that the numbers of individuals here in New York that are homeless are any less than those that are in New York, in Los Angeles. In fact, I actually would assert that we have more. We at the Coalition estimate that there are about 350,000 individuals that are homeless in New York City. That's enough people to fill Yankee Stadium 7.5 times. But the 4,500 or so that have been counted, and we know that there are some issues with the methodology that's used to count those that are on the streets. The 4,500 that we find on the streets are just a fragment of that, right? So compared to Los Angeles, that means that the homeless individuals here are largely invisible. And why is this? It's certainly not because of the reasons that people become homeless, because like in LA, people here also are having a hard time finding affordable housing. Evictions are up, and people are experiencing high rates of domestic violence. The reason it looks so different here than it does in Los Angeles is actually because of litigation that was brought back in 1979. now. I'm scanning the audience, and I'm guessing that for some of you that might feel like ancient history. But 1979, there was a case brought called Callahan v. Carey, which cited Article 17 of the New York State Constitution. And this provision doesn't exist in the California State Constitution, and I don't know, I haven't read all the state constitutions, but it probably doesn't exist in others as well. And that provision provides that the aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns and shall be, not if you want to, it can be, but shall be provided by the state. That provision and the litigation that unfolded led to what we now know as the right to shelter, which simply means that anyone in New York, regardless of their immigration status, has a right to receive shelter provided by the city if they have no other safe place to go. And this is rather unique. This is the only place in the entire country where we have this right. Massachusetts has a similar right to some degree, but it's very, very limited. And DC has one that's weather activated. But more or less, New York is the only place that has this right to shelter as we know it. And so as a result, of those 350,000 that we estimate to be homeless in New York City, 103,000 were living in a city shelter as of the end of August. And of those 103,000, 35,000 were children. So that gives you 103,000, the 4,500 or so that we estimate or have been counted as being street homeless. You're asking, where do the balance come from? Well, we estimate that over 200,000 people are living doubled up. So you may have heard the phrase couch surfing, but basically it just means that you're sharing someone else's home, oftentimes in really crowded conditions. A recent New York Times article reported that of the over 154,000 New York City school children who were homeless, using sort of the Department of Education definitions of homelessness, 89,000 were doubled up. So our 200,000 estimate might be on the low side, but nonetheless, we believe that what tends to happen, both from self-reporting and otherwise, is that those who are doubled up do that as a last resort before turning to the city shelter system or finding themselves on the street. Now, some might be fortunate enough to find a place to live, but the reality is that for so many, it's very difficult to find an affordable place to live. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. It's very expensive to find housing. And the data confirms that there are only 0.4% vacant units in the city that are renting for under $1,100. And we know the city has not been focusing on building housing for those on the lowest side of the economic spectrum. So the reality is, if you are making a single adult making up to $34,000 a year, or you're a family of four making about $48,000 a year, you will have an extremely difficult time finding an affordable place to live. And this is particularly concerning because, as Jenny's article vividly illustrates, we know that how to solve homelessness. It's basically having housing. For some, that's housing with supportive services, like those in 90 Sands. For others, it's simply just housing they can afford. So one of the things that we at Coalition for the Homeless are advocating that the next mayor do is focus on creating more affordable housing by, among other things, constructing about 12,000 units of housing each year for 5 years, half of which will be for those on the lowest side of the economic spectrum, and the other half will be homeless households or homeless housing to make sure that those that are otherwise languishing in shelters for a year or more, or those from the streets, have a place to go. And this investment will mark a significant increase in the number of houses that are constructed for this population. Because over the last 7 years, we've only completed about 3,100 units of housing for that population combined. And making that investment will therefore be the most critical thing that we can do if we truly want to end mass homelessness. Now, these steps are essential also right now in particular, given some of the federal policy changes that could result in more people ending up homeless or undermine the stability that's been achieved by formerly homeless individuals. You know, a lot of my conversations that I have almost every day at work tend to focus on what's going on at the federal level. And they tend to fall into two categories. It's either about federal budget cuts, or it's about the radical changes in homeless and housing policy that this administration is putting forward. Now, with regard to the fiscal issues, the federal government has already cut funding in many ways, including through a FEMA program, which recently provided about $5 million to New York City food banks and pantries. These organizations have had to dramatically cut services at a time when 1 in 6 people experience food insecurity in New York City. And we're seeing that number grow in the wrong direction because of current situation. The coalition itself lost funding, but thanks to support from the City Council and other generous donors, we've been able to continue operating the country's largest nightly soup kitchen, which has served meals, thousands of meals, to individuals in need every night since 1985. But along with the FEMA cuts and other cuts that are impacting nutrition safety, the federal government also announced that it will stop funding 7,700 housing vouchers in New York City next year. These were supposed to last until 2030. So the city is now faced with finding alternatives so that those 7,000 households don't have to turn to shelter. And as if those cuts were not drastic enough, we understand that there are plans to make substantial changes to HUD homeless funding, which could put another $174 million at risk, dollars that are currently being allocated to fund 8,500 units of housing for formerly homeless individuals and those on the verge of homelessness. Along with that, the administration has also indicated that it wants to dramatically change Section 8 and various other housing resources, which could add thousands more to having homelessness or housing instability. And this is just funding specifically for housing and homelessness. When you combine that with cuts to food stamps and Medicaid, we're looking at a situation where we possibly could see homelessness reaching levels beyond anything we've ever experienced in modern history. Now, I'm not being hyperbolic here. When we look at the shelter census and dig beneath the numbers, we see that while the overall census is declining, once you remove the asylum seekers from those numbers, we begin to see that actually there's an increase in the number of longer-term New Yorkers who are becoming homeless. In fact, between September 2022 and September of this year, there's been a 22% increase in the number of longer-term New Yorkers becoming homeless. The fact that this is occurring before the federal budget cuts become fully effective is particularly concerning. And then when you couple that with the federal government's seismic shift in homeless and housing policy, you begin to see that we're moving from a more humanistic, evidence-based approach to one that is about criminalizing and coercion. Some of this began last year when the Supreme Court passed or decided the case called Grants Pass. And in a nutshell, the case basically permits jurisdictions to fine and to arrest the very individuals that Jenny described who were sleeping on streets, in the parks, or in our subway. In addition, the president issued an executive order earlier this year that frames homelessness as criminal conduct that merits both the use of law enforcement to remove homeless individuals from public spaces, as has recently been done in DC, and curtail the certain privacy rights under the guise of ending crime and disorder. The executive order goes further in prioritizing coercion and discarding evidence-based practices like housing first, which began here in New York and has been quite effective in ending chronic homelessness for countless populations across the country. And despite the success of Housing First, the administration wants to go back to, 1, preconditioning housing resources on an individual's participation in treatment, and 2, increasing the use of civil commitments for those experiencing serious mental illness or a substance use condition. These simply just don't work. Here in New York, involuntary transports were already in place and were just expanded by the governor and Mayor Adams earlier this year. But even Commissioner Tisch acknowledged a few months ago that involuntarily taking someone to the hospital doesn't solve the problem. It just means, using her words, that they get released 2 hours later with a sandwich. Housing is the solution. And the coalition has asserted in Albany and locally that the city shouldn't continue this revolving door between hospitals and the street, but instead take advantage of the unique opportunity of having 4,000 vacant supportive housing units, similar to those that Jenny was just speaking about from her piece, It may require the city to be innovative in thinking about how to connect individuals to those units and what they need to do to make those acceptable for those that need to live in them. But we've done this before when we effectively eliminated veteran chronic homelessness in New York City. It just requires political will. So I'll wrap this up so that we can begin to have our conversation. But one thing to kind of take away from this is, even though the right to shelter must be preserved, and it is very valuable, and it definitely sets us apart and keeps us from not looking like Los Angeles, it's also critical for the city and its next mayor to prioritize housing and services, probably now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And there's so much to talk about and get into. But I might start by asking you a question, Jenny. Like, what Will has shared with us so many different really critical and striking statistics that are incredibly important to kind of contend with and digest. But sometimes, even the way my brain works, it can be hard for me to really understand the numbers without having a kind of human dimension as to what that actually means. Can you talk a little bit about how in your reporting that you've done for decades around homelessness, or maybe your work more broadly speaking, how you focus on kind of balancing and moving between thinking about systemic, kind of data-driven issues and framing them through a kind of human lens?
Well, I mean, I was a fiction writer first, so in a way, my qualifications, such as they are more about kind of being able to describe people and interactions and sort of find the details that hopefully kind of reveal a person to the reader in an efficient way. So that's kind of, I guess that's my natural inclination, is to write that way. What I find, though, is especially with a huge, complicated issue like homelessness, which modern homelessness, which I grew up not having seen. I'm that old. In San Francisco, no less. So there's the history of homelessness. There are all of the different elements that come into play. It is so complicated. The financial part of it, how supportive housing even exactly works financially, that was very overwhelming to me at the beginning of working on this. Usually I do the quantitative stuff, the sort of making myself conversant in the data, the history, the abstract stuff, at the same time that I'm just talking to as many people as I can constantly. And at the beginning, it often feels like the two are just separate undertakings. They have nothing to do with one another. But gradually, they begin to converge, and I start to see that there are lots of connections between the people I'm talking to, the experiences they're having, and all of this conceptual stuff that is known about the issue. And the goal I always have as a journalist is just to talk to so many people, so many more people than I quote unquote need to, by which I mean people that I'll actually put in the story, that I really understand in the end how to create a somewhat representative picture of the breadth of human beings involved in something, and also find a way to use their stories to illuminate and hopefully kind of elucidate all of the technical stuff, the data, the facts.
And maybe following up on that, thinking again about the misperception that exists around homelessness, stigmas that exist around homelessness, I think there's also oftentimes a lack of understanding of what it means for New York to be a right to shelter city. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those, addressing those kinds of challenges, misperceptions around right to shelter when you're talking to the general public, people, but also when you're talking to policymakers, and even when you're trying to hold the city accountable to what the right to shelter actually legally entails.
Thank you. And so I'll begin by acknowledging again, having come here from Los Angeles, learning about the right to shelter was part of the work over the last couple of years. And I came on board at the same time that we were dealing with the influx of new arrivals, or as we call them, or asylum seekers. And there was a lot of conversation at that time about, well, the reason people are coming to New York is because of the right to shelter. And it gave me pause on one level, because I was like, well, I was in LA. I didn't hear a lot of people talking about the right to shelter as the reason they're going to leave LA, if at all. So I don't see that. I think there's one myth out there that the right to shelter is drawing people in. And what we were seeing, of course, with asylum seekers is that people were literally being put on buses at the border and sent here. They may not have known where they were going. And in other instances, people have come to New York historically for opportunities for generations, right? And so it wasn't surprising that people would see this as the place that they'd want to end up. So I think one of the huge myths is that the right to shelter attracts people here, and so the homeless situation that we're experiencing is because of the right to shelter. I think ultimately, if we didn't have the right to shelter, we'd look like Los Angeles. I don't think we'd have fewer homeless people. I think we'd just have more on our streets. And at the same time, I think one of the things that the right to shelter has, it can't be the end all of the situation. Shelter is not a long-term housing situation. And unfortunately, because of the affordability crisis and other issues, we do find that people stay in shelter for quite a long time. And so, unfortunately, I think the right to shelter is sometimes blamed for why the numbers are what they are without taking into consideration the realities of everything that's going on. So that's one of the largest myths, I think, that we have to deal with, or misperceptions about the right to shelter. One of the other components that's becoming more real for me is understanding that it covers largely adults. And I say largely adults because I'm learning more about what it means for young people. So unaccompanied children, especially those that are 16 to 17, find that they may not find a place to be. They're too young to come into DHS. And sometimes they are turned away from the DYCD, the youth shelters, because they don't have capacity. The right to shelter does not extend to DYCD, so they don't have a legal obligation to expand their system in order to address the need. And so I think it was the early part of last year, we began to receive some numbers that suggested there were about 1,100 16, 17-year-olds that had been basically turned away and had no place to go. And if they have no place to go, then where are they going to be? If they can couch surf, maybe, but otherwise on our streets. So that's the other thing, is just understanding that the right to shelter unfortunately doesn't go in some ways deep enough in terms of providing that safety net for those that probably also need it just as much.
Thank you for explaining that and giving that additional context. Jenny, your article really focuses on supportive housing. And as we know, we've been discussing that we have this right to shelter amidst its limitations. We don't have a right to housing. And we know that supportive housing is one kind of solution to chronic homelessness amidst all of its complexities. And of course, it's not a far from perfect solution. But could you talk a little bit about what supportive housing does and doesn't offer? And if we know that it does help in some capacity, why is it that we have not enough supportive housing, especially, you cite in your article, that it costs more money to actually support people who are unhoused, living on the street, than it does to actually house people in supportive housing?
Well, so supportive housing is, in a way, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an apartment that includes services, and it is generally geared. It is a way because of what Will was saying about the right to shelter. New Yorkers who are long-term, sort of street homeless, who are living in the street for long periods of time, tend to have issues that make it hard for them to avail themselves of the right to shelter. And those usually come down to mental or physical disabilities and often addiction, or some combination of all of that. So those are issues that in a way make it hard to live stably in any way, and certainly make it hard to weather the shelter system, which can be pretty difficult. So the idea of supportive housing is that the person is given an apartment and also has access to services which basically include a caseworker and all of the assistance that that caseworker can provide. It does not include things like drug treatment, but it can include help getting drug treatment. It doesn't necessarily include counseling or anything like that, but but ideally, the way it should work is that the caseworker connects the tenant to all of the possible services that they need. And in fact, the caseworker is required by law to continue to report on the condition of the tenant, the progress of the tenant, the goals of the tenant. That's how it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work that way. Many tenants don't want to talk to their caseworkers, and they, in fact, don't have to. So it's a difficult thing for the caseworker because the caseworker is legally required to make contact with the tenant and report consistently on the tenant's progress, but the tenant is not required to comply with any of that. So it's a really tough job for the caseworkers who are not very well paid, and it may not be surprising to hear that there's an enormous amount of turnover in that population, and therefore a lot of unsteadiness for the tenants who have already experienced a lot of unsteadiness. All of that said, all of the people that I wrote about who moved into 90 Sands, the supportive housing building that I was writing about, and I was very lucky because it just opened for business right as I was starting to work on the article. So I was there on the very day that the first tenants moved in, which was in 2022. And my article came out a year later, and now here it is, 2025. So the building's been in operation for about 3 years. All of the ones who are still alive are housed. But Aisha, who I read to you about, she's gone. John Wood, as I said, he was discovered to have passed away during our fact-checking when there was a wellness check. The main subject of my article, who I called Jessica, passed away in September. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that every single person I have interviewed who had an addiction, whose fate I know, has passed away. So what that tells you is supportive housing keeps people housed. It absolutely works. But there are some problems it cannot solve, and that is really brutal to witness. And again, makes it extremely unsurprising that people who work with this population sometimes burn out. I mean, here I am talking about this 2 years after the article was published, and I spend a significant part of every day still trying to contend with the fate of my main subject, whom I was very close to and stayed very involved with. I mean, it's extremely consuming. And this isn't even my job anymore. What am I doing? Says my family. So it's very, it's difficult. But the people who didn't have addictions, who live at 90 Sands, are all still housed that I've dealt with. And that is a triumph.
Thank you for sharing that. And we talked about this a little at the beginning, but similarly, because I've been holding these log writing workshops for years, as I've tried to get in touch with different people whose words and drawings we're surrounded with, I've also encountered extreme difficulties calling a phone number that's off the hook, calling a phone number and it's been sold to somebody else. It's incredibly trying to form close relationships with people that are dealing with so many systemic failures and navigating homelessness and moving from shelter to shelter. Of course, this is even more difficult if you're an asylum seeker. I wonder if you could speak a little bit, Will, to thinking specifically about the challenges that asylum seekers and migrants face, especially with the increase of ICE. I mean, of course, we're covering a lot of different kinds of subjects here, because when we talk about homelessness today, this is so not a monolithic subject, but I don't think we can really talk about it without thinking really concretely about the presence of ICE, which for all we know is, 1 block away. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'll start by acknowledging that at the beginning of the influx of the new arrivals, it really did kind of force a lot of us in homeless services to think a lot more about how we do our work, because we may have had some individuals who were here from another country, but we didn't have the volume, and hence we didn't have the insight into the plethora of needs that that community had. Everything from language access and being able to literally get things in a language that you speak or that you read, to just some of the cultural issues that were coming up in shelter, just because the system wasn't really designed with that in mind. And so when we pivot to thinking about the current realities, it's largely about how to keep people safe and give them the support that they need, because some are seeking legal support, and unfortunately immigration legal resources are tapped out. They were tapped out probably before the crisis began, and they're strained even further. And so trying to provide folks with guidance about how to navigate a legal system that seems to change every minute, and then at the same time keep people safe either in shelter or in community. So one of our challenges has sort of been the same thing that you both have been describing, in terms of being able to make contact with folks, but have that rapport with them that they trust you enough to be able to be willing to engage. So we have to, as our role as the court-appointed monitor of the shelter system, hold the system accountable to make sure that the system's providing the supports that they need, and understand how they are responding to ICE showing up at a shelter. But it's harder to kind of think about how do you hold the system accountable to do what's necessary to be humane and to provide things that are kind of outside the purview of what the shelter system has been designed to provide. So those have been some of the challenges. And some of you probably heard a couple weeks, or last week I think it was, there was a raid right outside of one of the shelters, the row. And so outside on the steps, right? That's public property. That's not necessarily the shelter's purview. So what is the shelter's role in providing that support? So there's been a lot of engagement with mutual aid groups, a lot of other groups, just to try to think about how we can provide support. And a lot of it's know your rights. A lot of it's just trying to figure out how people do some safety planning in the advance, just beginning to think about, okay, if something should happen to me, does someone know how to access my materials or my documents in case those are necessary for my case? Or if I have kids, how they are going to be provided for if I get detained or something. So we've been doing a lot of that work as well, just trying to make sure people are taking the steps they need to protect themselves and provide those plans in advance.
I just want to double check something with you, Will, because one thing I remember from my reporting is someone who is not, who's not a citizen, or maybe just doesn't have a green card, is not eligible for supportive housing for sure. So there are no new arrivals in a place like 90 Sands. They can't go there.
That is correct. Yeah. So the housing options, that's the other challenge. So you might be able to have shelter, and there are some issues from time to time about how long they could stay in shelter and what they had to do to reapply for shelter. So that aside, there were few pathways out of shelter if you didn't have status. So you're right. Yeah, supportive housing was not an option if you don't have status of some sort.
Nor are city FEP's vouchers. So a lot of people end up getting stuck inside shelter who are non-citizens, because they're not eligible for the same kinds of supports that citizens are eligible for. And maybe before, while we're on this subject, I am one of those people who's very involved in mutual aid, just kind of realizing and recognizing the importance of what is happening systemically, but also massive systemic failures, and the extreme need for people to be able to organize on more of a grassroots level. I think we have a mass of people here today who are interested in this subject, or you wouldn't all be here slightly cold outside on a Saturday. Can you share some real concrete tactics for people who are interested in resisting, whether it's resisting the presence of ICE and the disappearance of neighbors, or different modes of organizing, whether with informal systems like voting or beyond when it comes to homelessness.
That's a lot. So part of it you're doing right now, right? Coming together, getting informed about what are the issues and trying to figure out how do I get plugged in. I think that's very critical because there's just a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, sometimes I don't do a lot on social media, but sometimes we do have to just check and see what's going on. And some of the information that's being put out there is just wrong. Like just giving people misinformation about these are the rights people have or these are the things you should do. Some of those things are just not accurate. So I think getting connected with organizations that do this work. So if we're talking about immigration issues, whether it's organizations like New York Immigration Coalition and some of those other groups that are on the ground really do understand what's happening and can give you information about, as a member of the community, how you can support, as well as if you are in contact with individuals that might be impacted, how do you give them resources, know your rights resources, so that they know how to navigate. So that's one of the things I would say. For ourselves, anyone that's doing homelessness related work or wanting to get more involved there, definitely check out some of the information that you've been provided a sheet that I think that was handed out. You'll see that on there is a QR code. That is going to take you to some of the platform that we pulled together to kind of give some guidance to the new administration, whoever it may be, as to what we think would be the solutions to ending mass homelessness. And so feel free to take a look at that. You can definitely join that petition if you'd like. But the main thing is just getting informed. The other thing, of course, you did mention voting. Today being the first day you can do early voting. That's how you can definitely get involved in shaping the policies that are definitely going to make a difference in how the city moves forward in addressing this issue. And regardless of who gets elected, make sure that you hold them accountable, because these are going to be issues that impact all of us. And I think it's important for us to make sure that they hear from us and understand that these are the solutions that we want them to advance. One thing I didn't note there that I want to also throw out is council boards or community districts. Getting involved in your community board is a great way to also impact sort of what's happening locally, really locally, like where you live. So I encourage you to think about doing that, because oftentimes community boards are also involved in decisions about, is there going to be a shelter or a supportive housing project or some other affordable housing unit that's going to be built in their communities. If you want to kind of inform that, I would say be part of those discussions to do that. I wish I could.
The question is about can Will speak to the referendums that are on the ballot?
Yeah.
Damn, I wanted you to.
So Coalition hasn't taken a position on the various referendums. So that's the reason I can't really speak to what they are. Uh-huh. I'm happy to afterwards provide folks with some information about some of our partners who I think have put out some materials that might be helpful. I can do that.
Before I want to turn to all of you, and thank you for raising a hand already, but I have one maybe final question while we're talking amongst us. Why do you work on this subject? Homelessness is something that's both very visible and I think increasingly getting more attention, but also largely misunderstood and also not reported on enough in all of its complexities. So why do you both choose to continue to, devote your life to advocacy and for decades to write about homelessness?
I think for me, it's two things. One is, as I mentioned, I remember a time when this problem, as we know it now, actually didn't exist. I mean, I was a wild teen in San Francisco. I wandered the city at all hours, and I left for college having never seen a person sleeping outdoors in San Francisco. If anyone's been there lately, you will know that that is a shocking thought. San Francisco is like LA in that the problem of homelessness is very visible there. So part of it is just that it feels new to me because I know it doesn't have to be this way, because I remember a time when it wasn't. And then the second thing I think is just very personal, which is that I had a brother who was schizophrenic. And he took his life 9 years ago, having struggled, for a very long time, and was also struggled with alcoholism. So I feel very connected to his marginality. I know that it was hard to keep him in any kind of stable situation, even with a family very focused on how to do that. And so when I see people who are clearly struggling mentally, I feel very much that that could have been my brother. And I think, like most people who know someone or knew someone well who had mental illness, the thing that we also know is it's not that far away from being quote unquote sane. So I feel I feel drawn to this population, and I can't see ever that ever changing.
I think that my story is very similar in some ways in terms of having family members that basically drew me into this space. And so I should back up and acknowledge that I grew up in rural Virginia and definitely didn't see homelessness in the same way that I see walking around New York or LA. But to the extent that there were people, I was fortunate to have had a grandmother that was very much the matriarch beyond our family in so many ways. We used to dub her being the unofficial mayor, because a lot of people would come to her with a lot of their problems and a lot of the issues that they were dealing with. But it also meant that we got to see firsthand some of the realities that people were dealing with. There was a neighbor that could not drive and had a lot of challenges just navigating just day-to-day life, and had another member of their household who was dealing with substance abuse and dealing with a lot of other challenges. But my grandmother was very much like, this is our neighbor. This is part of our community, and if they need something, we're going to be there to help them. So I think seeing that modeled and seeing that the response shouldn't be one of shunning, but one of how can I help, just kind of was embedded in me to feel like that's my role in society. And so I think that's what's led me to doing this.
Thank you so much. And I will say, similarly, in my immediate family, there are people that struggle with pretty extreme mental illness, substance use, have been served eviction papers, housing insecurity. I think I've noticed a lot of people who work around homelessness are people who either have grown up and experienced it themselves or have some deep connection to someone who struggles with similar kinds of issues. And I really appreciate you both for also sharing that and everything that you've shared today. But maybe we can open it up to larger questions from folks. You had a hand up before.
First of all, thank you all three, because you gave excellent picture of the situation today in New York City from different points of view. And I say that because I work for the Department of Design and Construction, and I'm specifically assigned to the shelters. And even someone who's been doing this, as I have been for 7 years, I learned so much from all three of you. And so thank you for that. But my question really is, and precisely because of how much I learned from you three, is there any kind of comprehensive database that lists not only the public shelters that I work with, which are the main ones of different categories, men, women, families, but also the supportive shelter that she spoke of? And it would be also interesting to know about the private shelters, because the more I'm involved with this, the more I realize that it's a vast network, and I've never, been able to comprehend the whole magnitude of it. And that doesn't even account for the people that are outside the system. So that's my main question. And the second thing that I want to say is, they're specifically to you as the artist in residence. are you aware of the 1% for arts? Have you, availed yourself of it? Right. So here's what I have to say. Like, currently I'm working on about, I've been assigned 12 shelters, right? And when they initiate, the project manager is responsible for triggering that 1% art. And very few project managers have even the wherewithal to request that funding and do it. But I definitely would like to speak to you about that. Okay, all right, because I'm one of those few managers who has done that. Like, for example, on Fort Washington, and on the I have about 3 or 4 shelters on 3rd Street. So yeah, thank you.
I feel like the data that I often turn to is from Coalition for the Homeless. Do you want to speak to that first part of the question?
Yeah, we do have quite a bit of data that we have on our website and what have you. I know that one of the challenges is when you were talking about all of the supportive housing projects, all the private shelters, a lot of that stuff is harder to come by because especially if it's, well, one, we don't have any monitoring authority of those, so that we don't have insight into them for that reason. But also if they don't have a requirement to report to the city, then they're not going to be covered by some of the local law reports that are commonly put out there. So it is hard to get some of that private information.
But I would also mention the Supportive Housing Network, which is kind of
Yes,
that's the organization that tracks all. I mean, but even that said, even they
Don't have
struggle
comfort.
to because they're all. I mentioned 90 Sands, which is a building, but supportive housing can also exist in a more ad hoc fashion where someone has an apartment and services come to them.
That's right.
And those become much harder to track. So it's. I mean, that's the kind of factual gathering that I found very challenging.
Yeah.
So I feel you.
Yes, yes, we do, yes.
And the percent for art we can talk about later. But are there other questions? Emilio actually works, sorry to put you on the spot, for the Department of Cultural Affairs. So you guys can talk about the percent for art.
Thank you all three for the incredibly informative presentation. I learned a lot, and my question is for Will. I know you can't speak directly to the referendums, but I was curious if you could tell us what the coalition's view on the most effective strategy for developing affordable housing in the city is. About 10 years ago, I worked with Picture the Homeless and the New York City Community Land Initiative to develop teaching tools on how to create the East Harlem Community Land Trust, which took about 6 to 8 years to finally get built and get people moved in. So it was a really slow process, but it was incredible because it takes property off the private market and makes it managed by the people who live there. But I understand that's a pretty slow approach. So that's my question is, what's the most effective way to address the crisis?
There are definitely a lot of tools in the toolbox that we should be exploring. But the interesting thing is that right now there are so many units that are not being utilized. So there are 4,000 supportive housing units that are available to the city. They do require some renovations. And so I think with some investment, those can be made available to folks more easily. Same thing with NYCHA. NYCHA has units that should be also renovated and made available. And I think that's the lowest hanging fruit. And with that, we then could then look at the things that are more capital intensive and also time intensive. But back in Los Angeles, we did a lot more with land trusts, community land trusts. And so I would like to think more about those models. I know that the resources are different here than they are in Los Angeles, but to the extent we need to think a little bit more creatively, because the reality is it can be expensive to build from scratch. It also, where are you going to put them? There's just not a lot of land, and so definitely want to think about using the existing resources though, because those are going without being utilized at this point.
Why are they empty?
Good question.
Sorry.
Very good question. I mean, some of them I think probably is the money, especially when you think about NYCHA. I know NYCHA is probably concerned about what the federal government might decide to do in terms of resources, so it may become more difficult for them to be able to renovate some of theirs. And I know there's a whole history of things with respect to NYCHA. But I think that there's capital issues that are involved.
I saw some hands kind of shoot up with
Yeah.
that question. Yeah.
We're part of a coalition we created with 4 committees. With NYCHA, they're empty because they're wanting to mow that place down, and they want to demolish it, and they want to put high rises. They want to put people out of their homes. We got 2 buildings they're trying to demolish now. Elderly, seniors, okay? They're constantly harassing them to get them out, and they haven't even given them final approval. Now HUD is going to give them an approval. That's what we're raising money for lawyers, and what we're doing is we're trying to fight that. We just had a court just recently. Unfortunately, the
Can I just say, so we're talking specifically about the Public Housing Coalition. There's 24 buildings that are slated to be demolished by related of Hudson Yards billionaires, $60 billion of assets to build luxury housing on public land, stuff public housing residents into towers, and it's understood to be a blueprint for NYCHA across the city. And so when we're talking about deeply affordable housing and addressing the issue of homelessness, there's, we need to preserve and maintain the housing that's existing. And we invite everybody to join us in our struggle, because actually tomorrow's the date that the 2 buildings that John was talking about, that people are supposed to be moving out. And there's this forced relocation that's happening. And, these are people in their 80s, 90s, disabled, so we really need everyone and to kind of come together around deeply affordable housing. So
yeah, the developers, they have management control over most of the public housing, well, over half anyway, and they're working to get their hands on all of it. And that's the real problem. The developers own the city, and we don't have the housing. You were right about the housing. That's the core issue, the very core issue. I know you do a lot of policy work. What are you doing on housing, development and things like that? And one more thing. Do you support City of Yes?
Everyone should take positions, yes. Okay.
Say no.
So I will say that on City of Yes, one of the things that we were concerned about is that it did not address these issues. It did not address how to make sure that there's housing for those at the lowest end of the economic spectrum. So while I can appreciate that there needs to be tools that allow us to think about how to create housing generally in the city, it's a question, an issue across the board, it did not speak to those issues. And so that made it very difficult for us to come out in support of City of Yes. So we did not. So in terms of the work that we're doing, so we're about to launch a housing campaign, and so part of it is to begin to think about, how many units we need, what type we need, and beginning to have those conversations with a lot of people in the community about what are some ideas around that. We do feel that, so much of the housing really needs to be at that lower end of the spectrum. Not to say we don't need housing at other tiers, but the city has been very clearly not investing at that level. And when you pointed out as well that preservation is also an issue, we need to think about how many units are going to no longer be available if we don't preserve those units on top of that. So we're actually conversation of our partners about how to begin to launch this campaign around creating more affordable housing. Thank you. And thank you for your work that you're doing now.
Maybe time for one more question. Yeah.
Are you doing sorry, hi. Are you doing any advocacy in terms of workforce development for the people who are doing this very difficult work and who are being underpaid and under cared for themselves? Is there any movement to help train them, and especially if our hopefully new mayor is able to have replace the police when it comes to mental illness. We just need a workforce that is well trained and well remunerated.
I'll also just add something that I learned throughout my time working with the Department of Homeless Services is sometimes there also aren't these very neat categories of someone who is a Department of Homeless Services client, like someone who's living in shelter and someone who works for the city itself. So there's actually kind of a staggering amount of people who are both, who are, paid so little that they can't afford a place to live and are simultaneously working for the Department of Homeless Services and a Department of Homeless Services client. I'll just add that when I started working on this project, it was really just only including people who were living in shelters, and more there were staff that were sitting in and saying, hey, could I add something? I have something I really want to share. So the project expanded to include some of those perspectives, and I think it's a really, really good point that you bring up. Jenny also spoke to this, real culture of burnout, work that is difficult and not paid well enough at all. And I do think there needs to be more advocacy around that on behalf of social workers as well. And we should probably leave it there. You all are so wonderful for being here on this chilly afternoon outside. And thank you really, though, to Jenny and Will. So admire both of your work, and thank you for sharing with us. Really appreciate your engagement this afternoon.